Hi everyone, welcome to my Research Ed talk. Thank you for taking some of the time out of your weekend to come and watch it. I know there are loads of other amazing talks going on, so I do appreciate spending part of your time with me. I am Vicki Barnett and kind of slightly varied background. I am currently a head of history at Jane Austen College in Norwich. Previously, I have been a local research lead at the Norwich Research School and kind of have developed my interest in research and the impact it can have on the classroom from there. And currently I'm part of team history for the Oak National Academy, so working at delivering lessons online for students whilst we're in this, dare I say, the U word, unprecedented times. So yeah. Today's talk then is going to be looking at the research that we can use to help turn our Year 11s into A-level students. This is very much a kind of summary of what is out there rather than any outcomes necessarily, because we're going to be looking at JAC at implementing this September. And so maybe I can come back next year and let you know how it's all going. So this is very much kind of the stage we're at, and hoping that you will find it useful if you are a school with a sixth form, thinking about kind of the different steps we can take to support our students coming back in September. My Twitter handle's on this page just in case you want to message me any questions or just kind of communicate about this topic. The idea is that we shouldn't just be focusing on history. The research is more general and hopefully applicable to a variety of different scenarios. So where did this all start then? So a few years ago, 2 years ago, we had an inset day at JAC, and the sixth form teachers got together to talk about the different problems that we were perhaps facing. So I've just listed some of them here, which I imagine for some other sixth form teachers seem quite familiar. I think there's a tendency when our Year 12 students start in the autumn term to think that there's been a radical transformation over the summer. And actually we forget that these students are realistically just Year 11s in their own clothes, or suits if you're a sixth form that asks for business wear. And we always hope that they're going to turn up and be really enthusiastic about our subject. After all, they have chosen to study it at a higher level. But actually, sometimes we discover that they're perhaps not that enthused. They don't want to contribute. So you may end up with a silent class in front of you. As teachers, we know there is quite a significant academic jump between what's required at GCSE and what's required at A-level in our subjects. For some subjects, things like sociology, politics, psychology, there may not have been any GCSE syllabus or exams to build upon. For other subjects, you may find that there hasn't been much correlation between what's being taught. So, for example, in our history department, we teach a unit which doesn't correlate with anything that the GCSE exam boards offer at that point. So they're coming in with no grounding in that at all. So you're starting from scratch. And in terms of thinking about exam technique and things like that too, often you're kind of having to reteach them how to do things in a different way, or building in completely brand new skills. So there is often a really big academic jump between what's expected of them in Year 11 and what's expected of them at A-level. And generally the consensus is that most people don't do the AS exams under the new system, and so you're teaching them how to write A-level standard essays from the very beginning. We also have a really big variety of ability in one class. Certain subjects at GCSE will have been streamed into ability groups, whereas at A-level you don't really get that. So depending on the entry requirements for the sixth form, you're going to have perhaps someone with a grade 5 up to someone who's got a grade 9, and you're having to teach that kind of huge variety of ability and make sure everyone is making good progress. The two following points are thinking about kind of how we want our sixth formers to be. Many students struggle with independent working, independent thinking. thinking about what they can do on top, so that we do have a bit of a lack of independence from some of them. They're quite used to having been set homework and certain things, and now all of a sudden they've got free periods, and what do we do with that? So that can be quite confusing for them. And sometimes there are issues to do with accountability as well. So at 11 to 16, often if homework isn't done, then there are detentions in place for that. And it's difficult sometimes to work out what you do with those students at a sixth form level. You don't necessarily want to put them in detention, but similarly, what's the motivation for them to do homework if they know that if it's not done, there won't be any repercussions? So accountability, making them more accountable for their actions, is quite a difficult area. And finally, what have they done over the summer? So you could have set all of the prep lists in the world, and you'll have some students who will have read every single thing on that prep list, watched every single thing you've asked them to, gone above and beyond that prep list. And then you'll have some students who won't have done any of it and use their summer holiday just to relax, which they're more than welcome to after the holidays. This, of course, is all being compounded this year with coronavirus. Apologies to the scientists if this is the wrong diagram. We know that we're going to have some students come to us. I'm thinking about my stepdaughter in particular, who is currently in year 11, who their studies finished March the 23rd, and they may not have done a great deal between March the 23rd and, again, if we're thinking positively, September when they're back in. So we are going to have students come who've had a really big gap from studying. When we were thinking about this at Jack, and we were thinking about how we wanted to change things, we had to think about, well, what's the long game? What do we want to kind of bring in instead? What do we want our sixth form students to be like? And ultimately, we're thinking about when they leave us at the end of year 13, how do we want to kind of send them off? What people do we want to have turned them into? So what do we want by the time they leave year 13? Someone who's fluent in the A-level content, who knows it inside out, they've mastered it, they can use it and manipulate it to a variety of different scenarios. But similarly, someone who's gone beyond the textbook. So I don't know about your different subjects. Our textbooks in history aren't always the greatest, so they will need to go beyond that textbook to be able to stand out amongst the many other people sitting those exams. So we're going to want students who can kind of read more widely. We want someone who can demonstrate higher level skills for our subjects. Thinking about kind of not necessarily just how to write a good essay, but kind of linking into that first point I made about how to manipulate the information in a variety of different ways, how to think, and this links into point 4, how to think like a historian or a psychologist, mathematician, a scientist, because that's kind of what we want to be able to call them by the time they leave us at the end of year 13. We want them to be able to identify as a historian, a psychologist, rather than someone who just kind of studies those things. And thinking kind of prior to that, all of us kind of at the end of year 12, beginning of year 13, have to write UCAS references for them. I'm sure you've all come up with those students. I'm sure we can all think of some where we have a student who turns up and does the work. They don't stand out because they've misbehaved, but we then have to come to write a UCAS reference for them, and it's actually really quite tricky to write something apart from they turned up and did everything that they had to, because we don't know much else about them. So how can we develop our year 11s into this type of student by the end of year 13? One of the key things I looked at, and this is kind of the key focus of this talk, is motivation. Because it is, as we know, a bit of a slog getting through the A-levels. They're really difficult at times. They can be quite tricky. To do well, you need to perform well throughout the whole 2 years. It is a journey, to use kind of reality TV show language. You want them to kind of work hard throughout rather than kind of putting in the hard work of the last 6 months. And so to do that, it's going to be about motivation. And motivation is going to be really important, more than ever before, because as I said, we do have some students in our worst case scenario who won't have picked up a pen from March the 23rd through to the beginning of September. And so we're going to have to re-motivate them to engage with our subjects and to transform into these students that we want in front of us here. So when we kind of thought about this a couple of years ago, started to look at motivation then, and it's been a case of looking at different things to do with motivation and pulling it all together, ready for this talk, ready for our start in September. What I think, though, is it was summarised really nicely by Adam Boxer. He wrote an article for Impact magazine, February 2019, about motivation. And this was the first sentence: motivation is a complicated beast. And I couldn't agree more. It is actually, once you start looking at motivation and the research behind motivation, you can very quickly find yourself in a wormhole. You've got intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation. You have got books looking at motivation to do with education and with business and just kind of human nature generally. There is a lot out there. I would highly recommend Adam's article as a really good starting point, and some of the things I'm going to talk about today have come from that, but looking at kind of other things I've pulled together as well. So I think there are kind of 3 things to consider regarding motivation before we start back in September. There is much more to look at in terms of motivation, but I'm trying to think about, for this talk, what does the research tell us? What can we try and implement and be thinking about ready for that start to give us the most successful start with this group of students when they come back? So the first thing I want to talk about then is success. There have been a number of different research studies that have also been more recently replicated. There are a couple of these in my sources list at the end, which tend to show that there is a strong correlation between students' ability and their motivation. If students feel like they are doing well in a subject, they are motivated and enthused about that subject. And so what we need to think about is, what can we do in the classroom to improve a student's performance? What can we do as teachers to create experiences in our classrooms to encourage success early on? Okay, and I know I kind of keep banging on about the fact that we're going to have students who, we've got to keep thinking this worst case scenario about students who perhaps have not studied from March. And so we need to kind of get them feeling successful really early on. Now, this becomes trickier if we're thinking about motivation, because students and teachers have different perceptions of what success looks like. And so there are a few people who've written about this. Dunlosky's talked about the student toolkit. Nuttall's book talks about students being kind of more engaged with things that do not take up much cognitive demand. And so students and their idea of success often involves low cognitive demand. So they will feel more successful if they have highlighted lots of text. They will feel more successful if they have made nice flashcards. They will feel more successful if in class they've done a task which involves some group work and not much thinking. They will feel that's a successful lesson. This tends to be kind of the stuff coming out of the work of Dunlosky and Nuttall. However, we as teachers know that success comes with tasks that involve more cognitive demand. And so we need to kind of balance those 2 things. We know that students' performance and their ability to recall information and to have success in the long term can come down to lots of low stakes testing, retrieval practice. The work of Carpicker and Roediger is really important on this. But this often can affect students' confidence, and it can affect their perception of how well they are doing. So thinking about the tasks we design are really important. It could be that low stakes testing in the first case is designed in such a way that all students in the class can achieve 60%, so that positive comments can be made about how students are consistently achieving 60% or above. Obviously, it's important we do this with avoiding rigor collapse. We don't want to make it so easy that we don't learn anything from those assessments, but those assessments can be crafted in such a way that success is achievable. So making kind of initial low stakes testing out of 10 questions, knowing that 6 of those answers should be easily attainable. Could be in the first cases that things like multiple choice questions are used, and eventually those are removed to create more open-ended questions. So thinking really carefully about low stakes testing to start with is going to be important. If you're a writing subject, thinking about breaking down those bigger writing tasks. So again, our students normally won't have written an essay probably from their GCSE exams through till whenever you set the first essay. So sometimes asking them to complete a whole essay to start with can be really daunting and not kind of contribute to much feelings of success. So breaking down writing tasks into much smaller chunks. The Writing Revolution textbook is really good for how you can do this, but also implementing things like worked examples and modelling, showing your thinking before they go and do it independently is going to help that feeling of success. I also think the final point here on this slide, teachers explaining the rationale behind tasks is going to be important. If a student's comfort zone is, if I highlight this and read it, then I will feel successful, and we're asking them to do something which is more demanding, e.g. a low stakes test, then we need to be confident in explaining the rationale behind the tasks. So we are asking you to do this because the science shows that low stakes testing across a period of time has a more positive effect on results than just highlighting and rereading. So explaining the rationale behind tasks will be important for encouraging success and for encouraging student buy-in. Now, this leads into the next thing about motivation for students, and that is teachers themselves. We do, of course, talk quite frequently to students about how they shouldn't choose things based on who their teachers are going to be, but with all the best will in the world, that will always be an underlying factor. So when we're thinking about student motivation, particularly in those first few weeks and months, we need to remember that students buy into their teachers too. Now, this first point, there are a really good series of blog posts by Joe Kirby who talks about how important teachers are to motivation. And he breaks it down into 3 key areas as to why we are important. So he talks about how for motivating students, students need to trust us. And students need to trust that we are teaching them the right content, that we are teaching them the right skills, that we are doing things at the right pace, because that's what's best for them. So I think communicating those things early on is really important. Similarly, he talks about how us showing some understanding to students is really important. This isn't me saying we should be their friend. It's about us recognizing that we understand their problems. So it could be that before approaching a task, we can say, I understand this is a tricky concept, or I understand this essay question was hard, but here's how I would do it. It could also be a recognition of, I understand that you're studying for A-levels and so your workload is high. So any kind of areas where we can show understanding with students is going to encourage their buy-in to us as adults. And helping them succeed links back to that previous slide that I've just been talking about. Now, as well as this, one thing that I've been looking at is this idea of expectations. And there is an effect called the Pygmalion effect that was first coined in 1968. There was a study undertaken by Rosenthal and Jacobson, which in a classroom environment, they said to a classroom teacher, I think it was 8, these 8 students are your highest ability. In reality, those 8 students had been picked at random, but the teacher's expectations of those students changed. And as a result, they projected higher expectations onto those students, and those students performed higher than other people in their class. And this study has been replicated time and time again, and it always shows that teachers' high expectations can have an impact on results. Now, it's important that we revisit these high expectations throughout the year. So at the beginning of the year, setting out these expectations about what students should bring to lessons, about how they can contribute, etc. But you can also revisit these expectations at the beginning of a new topic and on a kind of more micro level at the beginning of a new task. So making sure that we are projecting high expectations on students is going to be key. What we don't want to get into the mindset of is, oh, these students haven't been in a classroom since March and so will be a bit slower. We should have the same expectations of these students that we would have had normally, if not kind of higher, to set the bar higher. It's also important that we understand that expectations aren't aspirations. And we need to be really careful with our language and how we communicate this with students, so that students don't get into a kind of trap, and that we kind of get caught in a trap of, well, if I work hard, I can get an A grade. We know, heart of hearts, that that's not going to be the case for everyone who works hard. And so it's really important that expectations are on things like behaviour and attitude and tasks, rather than kind of what your grade is going to be. So making sure that you're not muddling the two will be really important for your relationship with students throughout the 2 years. What the studies do also tend to show, though, is that it is important that students also have high expectations of themselves. We can project high expectations every single lesson for 2 years, but if students don't have similar high expectations, then actually they'll struggle to have the same results. So I think this is where we need to have conversations with students and get to know them a bit one-to-one. I know that's really tricky because we have limited time and we've got a job to do in terms of teaching the content. But if you're a sixth form tutor watching this, then I think kind of being able to have conversations about, or with students, about expectations and what they believe they are capable of, and remembering that expectations aren't aspirations, then maybe that will have a knock-on impact and just mean that the implementation of teachers talking about high expectations will have a more positive impact as a whole. Now, this feeds into the final point, which is about peer culture. And again, with all the best will in the world, we do need to acknowledge that generally as a species, we want to conform to peer group norms. I've been reading a book called Atomic Habits by James Clear because I'd quite like to have some positive habits in my life. That may sound like I don't have any. But he talks about how if you are someone who wants to improve your running and it gets to Friday and you've got a run scheduled, but all of your friends are off to the pub because it's the end of the work week, then it's going to be really hard for you to want to go and do that run when everyone else is doing something different. And we need to kind of, you know, we do that as adults, so we need to bear that in mind when we're thinking about our students. And so in that book, he talks about this idea of controlling the environment. And so if we want students at the end of year 13 to be historians, to be mathematicians, to be scientists, then we need to create the environment where they can do that. And this can be done on different scales. So as a classroom teacher of sixth form students, you can create an environment where you expect everyone to be a psychologist or to be a historian. Now, obviously, we're not talking about the academic professional historians or psychologists or scientists, but where it is okay and, dare I say it, cool to be whatever subject it is that we're teaching. This can be done in a variety of different ways. So all I've done here is kind of give us a few suggestions that we can try out. So it could be about creating an environment in your lesson where everyone is expected to contribute and not necessarily to you. Because I think with the best will in the world, we can try and make the environment a friendly one where we want people to contribute, but actually they are a bunch of nervous 16-year-olds and no one wants to put their head above the parapet for the first few weeks. So breaking that down sometimes into peer work, where they've got to talk to the person next to them before you go to a few of them, just means that they are more used to talking about historical work, talking about kind of psychological studies, talking about kind of the maths they've been working on. And it's normal for them to be talking about that, and hopefully we'll see confidence build. Also, just kind of working on things like cold calling, some of the Douglamov things that we normally associate with 11 to 16-year-olds, getting students to expect that they could be chosen at any point to contribute. Obviously, we would love a scenario where everyone is straining at the bit to make a contribution to lessons. I think I've been guilty in the past of hoping that that's the case, and actually the norm becomes a slight tumbleweed scenario, and I'm hoping that 2 or 3 of them will make a contribution. I think kind of setting off at the beginning that, everyone should be able to contribute something either to their partner or to you, just kind of creates a more studious atmosphere. Again, thinking about expectations, everyone's expected to bring the work, so the pre-reading. Creating an environment where everyone is an expert and it's okay to be that. Again, kind of thinking about personal experiences. Having talked to sixth form students previously, perhaps they don't want to make contributions because they're hearing the same person contribute, and that same person is someone who's going and doing wider reading, and it can feel like the other students don't know as much, and that can kind of link into issues with regards to motivation and success. So thinking about this idea of everyone being an expert, that's, just because this student has read this thing, well, you've read that, so tell me about that. And it's okay for that scenario to be the one. Another way to think about peer culture and motivation is a visual way to track people doing work. At the beginning of call it lockdown or quarantine, and at the beginning of this unprecedented time, one of the research ed talks I watched was one by Harry Fletcherwood, and he was talking about how do we get students to engage with everything that's online if we can't track them all the time. And he talked about how language is really important, and so thinking about putting up posts or saying well done to the 95% of you that did your homework, so that if you're the 5%, you feel quite bad for not having done it because you're in the minority and everyone else is doing it, feeding into this idea of peer group norms again. One of the good ways to perhaps do this is to track the sixth form students doing their work. One of the things we've implemented both whilst being online at Jack, but also kind of prior to this point, is this idea of a delivery map. And some subjects do it so that students have to upload a link to their homework or classwork, as we've been doing whilst being online. And so this idea that everyone can kind of see who else has contributed, and if you're the one person who hasn't, then you're going to feel like you're not fitting in with the peer group norm at that point. So this is often quite a good way. They would have to do that homework anyway, but kind of seeing it somewhere visual just kind of puts a bit more pressure on them to do it. One thing we've been trialling too in history is UCAS reading forms. So thinking about how students can tell us what they have been reading above and beyond the textbook, but in a way kind of where we create it as a norm. So you're not the one person who's read something different. Actually, it's part of what everyone is doing. So we set up a Google sheet where people could log what they've read related to the course, but similarly what they've read that's not related to the course. And then as more and more students filled that in, we saw it kind of snowball and contribute. So again, this thinking about peer group norms, if you can see that other people are doing it, you're more likely to do it yourself. If you're thinking kind of wider though, if you're a sixth form tutor or sixth form leadership, creating peer culture can be done in a different way. So sharing positive stories from across the sixth form is going to be really important. Thinking about kind of the work that students are doing beyond the classroom, if they're working for charities, if they're kind of doing research projects for things like that, essay writing competitions, again, sharing that so more people start to think that that is the norm rather than kind of anomalies. One of the things that could be done is inform time sharing great UCAS references. They know what to aim for. I think a lot of students don't quite know what teachers are writing at this time, and that you're not just going to get a great UCAS reference if you are a 3A star student. And looking at kind of how the different subjects pull together. So if you want to do marine biology, but you're studying biology, Spanish and history, looking at how the teachers craft references to make you an individual amongst other UCAS references, so students know what type of things they could be doing to help that, ultimately modelling success. Why would students do things if they don't know what that looks like or what it is that we are trying to create about them? And similarly, kind of last point, this idea of thinking about influencing the influencers. Even at sixth form in the year groups, you've got a couple of the cool kids who perhaps influence others. So if you're a form tutor, if you're, it doesn't even have to be a form tutor, if you're a classroom teacher, if you can influence that one student doing one extra period of study a week, then others will follow them if they can see that happening. So working and targeting those groups and just creating a peer culture where it is normal to do study and it is completely fine to talk about your subject in an enthusiastic and passionate way. And as teachers, us creating the environment for us to be able to do that, that's all going to feed in to motivated students. If they can see that it is normal to be academic and talk in an academic fashion, then that will hopefully keep them motivated throughout the 2 years. Now, as I said, this is very much kind of the beginning of things for us, particularly in the history department at Jack, and we're going to be looking at how some of these work over the next couple of years. So this is kind of me just pulling things together with my initial thinking. I don't have anything that necessarily says whether these things work. If you have, please get in touch and let me know, because it would be great. And this is certainly not the only stuff about motivation out there. Obviously, you can talk about motivation to do with attendance. You can talk about motivation in a variety of different spheres connected to education. And so this is certainly not everything out there at all, just merely a starting point and merely some suggestions. So I'm going to finish this talk with kind of list of some of the references that I've talked about, but also some of the ones that are kind of underpinning what's being said in this talk. So I think if you've not looked at motivation before, the Adam Boxer article in Impact is a really good place to start. If you're thinking about different level of cognitive load for students and tasks, the Dunlosky Strengthening the Student Toolkit, most commonly used for revision, but thinking about in-class tasks too. Joe Kirby did a whole series of blog posts on motivation back in 2014. They're really good, and talks about quite a few of the studies that I have referenced. Then you've got Nuttall's seminal text on the hidden lives of learners. This is really, really quite good, not just for thinking about motivation, but other things too. And then you've got kind of two of the more scientific studies looking at student motivation and success. So they're all there and hopefully will provide a starting point. Any questions, please get in touch over Twitter. I really hope you've enjoyed your research ed experience, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you get in touch with me via Twitter. Thanks, everyone.